Hello, my name is Renee L. Rose. I'm the founder of Explore Art Talk. With Explore Art, our featured guests, we have meaningful conversations celebrating artistic and cultural diversity that makes our world extraordinary. So sit back, relax, and check out our content. Thank you for joining us today. There we go.
All right, terrific.
Thank you. Thank you. So, how is it going today?
Today's been delightful. I just got back from a meeting in Syracuse with the Everson Museum, or the Iverson Museum. I have to correct myself. And went pretty well. Overall, had a beautiful time in Syracuse, and I'm excited. I am spending this week finishing up a new painting.
Oh, are you going to be exhibiting at the museum?
Um, we're looking into that. Early
Oh,
talks is the first time I've had a chance to meet the curatorial team. So hopefully in the
wow.
future, they seem like a great team. I'd love to collaborate with them in the future.
Oh, that is awesome. That's just awesome. So, let's go over you getting into the arts when you were younger and how that happened.
That's a great start. So, the way my family tells it, I was always kind of drawing my characters and things, whether it be my Yu-Gi-Oh characters, my Pokemon characters, all kinds of things. Over time, I ended up being in different art classes and different initiatives. And my mother saw that potential and said she wanted to prioritize me having really important mentors in the Rochester area. So she put me in contact with a local artist named David Haygood. David Haygood's a widely respected artist in Rochester, New York. He's done mayoral portraits, and he's a really recognizable figure in the community. He's been a mentor of mine since I was about 12 years old, and he really gave me those beginning tools to help cultivate the relationship and the love for the arts I have now.
How did you meet him?
My mother, there was an event, the Black Heritage Gala at the Hyatt. I want to say the exact year escapes me. I want to say it would have been 2008, 2009. And he happened to be there, and my mother like started that conversation, introduced us, and from there I ended up working with him. I want to say every other weekend for a few years, and then from there, high school and other mentors came along.
Oh, that's awesome. So after you graduated from high school, did you go into art in college?
Yes, my bachelor's, my initial degree was in illustration with a focus on editorial illustration and comic books.
Oh,
That was a really delightful program at RIT at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Um, One thing they really wanted to prioritize for us there was an understanding of our technical skill. So that's something I appreciate to this day. They really prioritized us understanding how materials worked, how to experiment with different things, to try materials out we don't necessarily like, partially because you might find out you do like them.
yeah.
Often with artists, we all have our own biases, our own approaches to things, and at times that can shield us, or not shield, it can remove us from a really lovely opportunity. And yeah, the illustration program was delightful for me.
Oh, wow. So after you graduated from undergrad, did you get your master's in fine art, or did you just go out and become an artist?
Immediately went right back in. I was fortunate enough that the scholarship program I used for my undergrad applied partially to my master's program. So transitioning from illustration, I graduated in 2019. I immediately went back in for my master's program and graduated from there with a studio fine arts degree in 2021.
I'm sorry, I was just looking at something. Okay.
Okay.
So you didn't feel the need to take a break. You really just wanted to keep going while the opportunity struck.
Absolutely. I found the programs, the initiatives where they were really great offers. And as well, while I was working, I felt I wanted this period where in my master's program, I was more encouraged to be a bit more conceptual in my work, to develop not only how to say things, but really explore what I wanted to say, which wasn't something that was foreign to me. I had a really good idea of the work I wanted to make since I was really young. But the opportunity to refine it in a highly academic space was a real privilege, and I credit a lot of my thesis advisors, Levon Shepard, Clifford One, Eileen Bushnell. I had a great time with that team, and they really helped cultivate the artist I am today.
So, what mediums did you work in when you were at
Um,
college? And
in college, what didn't I? I'm trying to think.
you did them all.
The illustration program really put that into us. So I would say of the ones I preferred, um, I think most people start off with pencil of some kind. I eventually moved into pen and ink, charcoal, watercolor, gouache, acrylic, Conte, a pastel, chalk pastel, oil pastel, and
Oh.
then eventually, ironically, oil painting was the last one I had gotten to.
I'm an oil
Um,
painter. I was like, he's got to mention oil painting.
yeah, well, that's what got to me. Where while I was working, and this is something I feel like is what inspires a lot of my academic work, where oil painting at times has come off as a fairly elitist medium, something that you kind of have to. There's a this aura associated with it that where people feel like you have to be a really good artist to do the medium, or that who does do it and who doesn't do it is something that has felt very intentional. So for years, I didn't really approach it, but I also always had a love for it. So while I detailed all the previous mediums, one of the realities of that was I was doing watercolor because I was a certain way I could make it look like an oil painting. I was doing gouache because you could build it up a certain way to look like an oil painting. I was using colored pencil because if you build up enough of that waxy or buildup, it looks like an oil painting. And eventually, one of my mentors took me to the side and said, "Unique, at some point, you got to oil paint at this point because every time we're in a meeting, you say, oh, it kind of looks like an oil painting." And he's like, "Unique, just oil paint at this point. Like you're taking all these other mediums that you're really good at, but you're like bending and warping them to look like a medium you're not even trying." And
Wow.
and
Oh,
that really caught me around the end of my undergrad, and my master's was when I went full into painting. So I've been an oil painter, I would say, for the last 5 years.
yeah. I never took formal classes, but I've been in oil painting since I was in high school. And the reason why I like the medium because it's so versatile. You can thin it
Yes.
to make it look like watercolors. You can make it thick. It's just so much you can do with it. And you can make it textured looking, and then I think to me, watercolors are harder because with oil painting, you can erase your mistakes. I mean, you
Right,
can
you can scrape it up and call it a day.
exactly. So I'm so glad you decided to do watercolors. I guess I'm a little biased towards watercolors because of the versatility, although I love art from all the mediums. So when you graduated from your master's, did you start really developing your personal work more, or what exactly did you do after that?
So shortly around the time of me graduating with my master's, I began working on a body of work, portraits of people in my personal life. This ranged from partners, friends, people in the community, things like that. And what ended up happening was there was an event that came up called the Finger Lakes exhibition. The Memorial Art Gallery of Rochester does a exhibition every 2 years or so, 2.5 years, where they do a collection of artists from the Finger Lakes region. This would have been the 67th, I believe, and I submitted some work for that. I had two works that were accepted into the show, and of the work that was submitted, one of them, the Eclectic Man, was really well received by the audience. And the Memorial Art Gallery from that body of work ended up shortly after I graduated my master's, purchased that piece for the permanent collection, and it's to this day currently on display in the
Wow,
modern art section.
what an honor. That is really
Yeah,
nice.
it was. And that museum, I've been going to that museum since I was a child. My my high school is down the street from that museum. So I joke with some of the current curators where some of the iconic pieces have been in fairly the same places over the years. So I joke with them that I could walk around this museum with a blindfold on and just point at a wall and tell you the name of a piece, the dates, the times, the year it
Love
was
it.
brought into the museum, and that's something. Yeah, it's a delight. One of my favorite pictures is of my mother next to the piece itself in the museum, partially because like my love for that museum, but also my love for the arts. While I credit a ton of mentors, I really have to center that with my mother. She took a lot of time to recognize that in me and cultivate it, and I'm aware of the fact that often a lot of kids, especially kids from lower income areas like myself, are often talked away from the art fields. And I can't blame people necessarily for doing that because they're not normally informed of the financial elements of it and how to make it a sustainable field. But I was very privileged to have a mother who saw that potential in me and saw the joy it brought me, and continue to provide a safe space for that.
So, did you really want to continue doing portraits? That's your main focus, or do you do other types of paintings?
Portrait and figure work is overwhelmingly the body of my work. I really enjoy it partially because I'm really invested in storytelling to an extent. I think all works of art exist in a context. They tell you a story about the sitter, about the person. Most importantly, they tell you about the painter themselves. But I think there is a task to be done with that, to tell stories that matter, to tell stories that are often potentially unseen or under highlighted. I think when I do portraits of people, the way I say it is that uh, I want to depict them on their own terms and not the terms that are projected onto them. This is why a lot of my work focuses on people from marginalized communities, people in my personal life, folks who, if you walked into a museum, the likelihood of you seeing someone who looked like them is relatively low. Someone who their truth and their narrative is something that's not often seen in academic spaces or museum spaces. And while I do think, I want to be clear, I think the modern era of museums and galleries have done a better job of reconciling that. I
Mhm.
think that is an endeavor that we're compensating for hundreds of years where certain voices were not seen and witnessed. And that's saying hundreds of years relative to the American standard, not even talking globally. I think my preference for portraiture and figure work is something I find I'm very compelled toward, because I do feel like it gives me that opportunity to depict a vital and essential narrative that I feel best reflects the diversity of the human experience.
With saying what you just said, which is really well said, do you think Gen Z, they're focused on more presenting art to the art world in forms that haven't usually been depicted or really be welcomed?
I'm sorry, could you say that again, please? I'm sorry, I just
Okay, that's okay. So I'm wondering, for being a Gen Z artist or being in the group of Gen Zs, do you think the Gen Z are presenting art to the art world that has not been represented as much? And are they also presenting art to make the art world open to other aspects of what we considered art, or what we have presented by the people that run the art world, what art is?
I would say yes. As I mean, I was born in '96. I'm either the youngest possible millennial or the very oldest of Gen Z. It really depends on how you look at the mid '90s. But the way I look at it is I do find that with every younger generation, especially relative to the arts, there is a certain challenge to the forms. And that challenge to the form is something that is often put to the side within that first 10, 15, maybe even 20 years. But over time, you find that work to become more relevant as cultural mindsets change, as different audiences respond to the work. So I would say I think I think Gen Z is playing the role that every generation plays at a certain point.
Mm.
I would say as well the different mediums, techniques, and as well I think there's a greater call to do work like I've mentioned, the depiction of the underseen, the depiction of the marginalized, to challenge both academic and museum spaces to be more comprehensive of the human experience.
And also, do you find that you're a millennial? That's what I think you are, generation.
Yeah, that's fair. I think so.
Yeah. So, do you find that the younger generations are also, let's say, even with portraits, not depicting them in a different way than just the traditional portrait way to tell the story that they're trying to tell?
In my teaching, I teach at RIT relative to painting courses. I teach non-toxic practices relative to painting safety. Um, in
Oh.
my practice with the students I work with, often I find that they are exploring more abstract themes, things that aren't necessarily directly representational. I think there is a tradition of that they're tapping into, certainly. I think one of the bigger values, I think, in the modern era is that people are much more comfortable. And this is in a post-modern art, a post modern art era as well. Um, Era where we've seen you know, we've seen Basquiat, we have seen these artists that are very abstract and like Cy Twombly. We've seen these artists who are very their mark making is something that is different from being perfectly representational while
Yeah.
still conveying representation. And I think that is something that my students and myself as well have been exploring over time. I'm excited to see the different ways people want to do that. And I think that's something that is it's ever changing. It really excites me when I go to gallery shows as well because
Yes.
you literally don't know what you're walking into. And I think
Yeah.
there's really magic in that.
It's refreshing.
Yes, that's a great way to word
Very
it.
refreshing. And I was thinking, the reason why I asked that, I was thinking about the portraits that were done for Michelle and Barack Obama, the president,
Yes.
lady. That's the first I've ever known, obviously for presidential portraits to be. That was a good example because I got a chance to listen to people my age, because I'm in my 60s, that, were questioning like, ooh, why would they do that? And that doesn't look right because they're so used to being a standard type of portrait. But I thought both of those portraits just told a much more of a story about them as people.
Oh, absolutely. The presidential portrait was done by Kahine Wiley, and then Michelle's portrait was done by Amy Sherrill.
Yes,
Both of them are seminal artists. I genuinely think both of them are probably the better one of the most significant American artists and global artists. To be perfectly transparent, I think their work is stunning.
yeah,
But I also agree. I think their work and their choices on how they're challenging things to add a certain level of aesthetic to the work. I've personally found presidential portraits to be deeply boring up until
yes,
Peter Riley's. I always find them to be, three-quarter profile. They're holding a book or parchment or
yes.
something.
Like, give me a
Um,
break.
and then you have like, most of the, unfortunately, not there aren't as many portraits of the first ladies as well. So I think the commitment to that work to making sure that it's done, it's challenging and new is really it's understated. I think how big a deal that is. I think it's a presidential portrait that really challenges like the conventions. And I
Yeah,
think conventions play as a roadmap, but I think a lot of art is defined by going off road. I think you want to
yes,
have the skills to handle being off road, which is why I really recommend students learning fundamental skills and understanding how they work materially. But I do encourage people to experiment and grow outside of that. The way I tell my students is that if your art is a house, like it's physically a house, you want to have a strong foundation. So whatever you build on top of that house, whatever the hallways look like, the electricity, the wiring, whatever it looks like for you, no matter what, you have a strong foundation, which is again why I encourage so many people to practice their fundamental skills, especially younger artists. I think there's a lot of value in understanding how things work, so you can understand how to shift them and change them. Um, it's more or less, I think there's value in knowing what you want to say and also knowing the best ways to convey it.
yeah,
Art plays a role where it is, to a certain extent, art is about the audience. It is, I would argue, almost inherently about the audience.
yes.
But the
Like
artists themselves
conveying a
is,
message.
yeah, but the artists themselves is also the first person to witness it. So making a work that can resonates with yourself and then resonates with the intended targets. And sometimes there isn't an intended target. Sometimes you make work and it's just yours. But in the wider academic, museum, and professional spaces, one of the things I encourage my students to consider is how do you make work that is honest to yourself while still conveying the
Mm,
points you're intending? How do you touch on your backgrounds,
interesting.
your cultural roots that are in ways that are accessible, but also maybe they're not accessible to everyone. And maybe that's partially the point. Maybe some work is about a very specific experience that certain people might understand and others won't, and making a intentional choice about that occurrence.
Well, one thing I like about those two portraits, it was extremely risque. I
Yes.
admired those artists to take that chance, with them being so prominent in their career, to be able to do that comfortably and just put it out there. It's kind of the same way Kendrick Lamar, what he just did at the halftime. I mean, you got
Yes.
to have a lot of confidence and be very sure of yourself to not be concerned about the criticism, but to challenge, the system that's just consistently doing the same thing that to me eliminates a lot of people. I admire that so much. I
Yeah,
mean,
and the thing I find as well, Kendrick Lamar's halftime performance is a great example
oh,
where
it's
when
just
you challenge the norms, you'll find that there are people who are like, "Oh man, I mean, to quote Samuel L. Jackson, he was like too loud, too reckless, too ghetto,"
yes,
and
yes,
the element of yes, it was critiqued, but we have the numbers. Kendrick Lamar's halftime performance was either, I think it's, I've looked at different numbers on it. It's either
I think they said
second to or slightly above Michael Jackson's performance. Like
they said it
it
was
is,
number one, right?
yeah. So it's either like it is at the bare minimum, at absolute lowest, the second most watched performance, but probably the number one performance. And that's really the truth of the
That's
matter. I think
amazing.
we challenge the status quo in a way that reflects our understanding and mastery of it. I think Kendrick Lamar is a terrific example
Yes,
because his research into his work, he is so committed to his craft that he understands it as a
yes,
medium. So when he does things that stand out of the ordinary, usually it is done in a way that is very intentional and has a propagandic esque feel
yes.
that I feel like it really gets to the heart of the audience. And I think I agree as well. I think Kahide Wiley and Amy Sherrill did something very similar.
It was like both the paintings and his work was like poetry to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because forever it's gone down in history, but there are works that you can look at and study, and just people in the future will get a lot of meaning and understanding what was going on in that period of time. Because that art
Mm-hmm.
is like architect to me. I mean anthropology. Because when the future, when somebody, let's say 100 years from now, they can look back and say, ah, I get an aspect of what was going on in America for people of color and how they're expressing themselves, and just a whole lot of different meanings in it. And I think that's what makes a great artist when you're
Mm-hmm.
able to put your first, I think artists, you're brave because to be able to put yourself out there, it's like you're revealing yourself naked to the world and say, here, this is what I'm presenting, and this is for you, and let's see what you get from this piece. It can be a very individualistic thing for the person watching the painting or listen to music. So artists are able to, like you said, hit that point where a person can come away and say, ah, this is what I got from that, to really engage them and not be
Mm-hmm.
standing there telling them. I just think that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing. So, um, as a younger artist, one of the things I'm finding that I have a little bit of a problem with is there seems for the first time, maybe not the first time, but there seems to be a real gap between mature artists, I say 45 and older, to artists that young like you guys I like seem to be like finding your own paths, not doing things in a traditional way, only things that you only have to be in, let's say, a gallery or an art basel to get your audience. Of course, we have internet now, and I don't see as much, and I'm really challenging a lot of mature people that I know reaching out to provide that mentorship to guide the younger people, say, this is the way the business has been done, but you can take it further. Of course, teachers do that, but I don't see a lot of connection with these older artists. Is that just
Mm-hmm.
me, or do you find something different?
I think it really comes down to the sense of community that artists create in general. And one of the core parts of community is the ability to have new participants. Um, I find that in my experience, I've been privileged to have exceptional mentors throughout my life at different stages, especially as an artist. I've had the privilege of being a younger artist who've had our older artists who've been open and willing and taken the time to
Oh,
pour time and energy and resources into me that I can't thank enough for that. But I do recognize that's a relatively not necessarily uncommon experience, but it's not always likely. Depending on the environment you're from, especially relative to first, you have to consider, does a young artist even live in an environment where the arts are considered very respected? And then in that environment, are the people who are in that there themselves, are they themselves open to being mentors or advisors for younger folk. I think those are two larger questions that at times we take for given in the arts community. I think we are more social people overall, but the people make the assumption that we are always, we're always these open communities, and that's not always necessarily true.
Yeah.
Relative to newer mediums and newer ways to reach out, I do think part of that is just a matter of different eras. In my case, and for people younger than me as well, we grew up where Facebook already existed, predated us. We grew up in a world where these more social media platforms are our natural spaces. So I think there's an easier way for it's more intuitive for us to grapple with these digital spaces in ways that previous generations have not. But I
Yeah.
also think there's a tremendous opportunity there to offer back and forth. I think younger generations of every era offer something important to previous generations, and I'm sure when I'm in my 60s, I'll have younger artists themselves who can offer something to me that's beyond my natural purview.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of the nature of community is not just always offering, it's also being in a space where you can receive new information. And I think I would have to say I think it leans a bit more case by case depending on, again, if a community exists and then the nature of that community. But
Yeah.
overall, I do think younger artists are more we are challenging the natures of what is an arts space, what is meant for larger spaces. And I think museums and other spaces, these more established entities, they're playing a not necessarily a game of catch up, but they are recognizing that they have to adapt to both maintain their modern audiences and encourage future audiences. And that malleability, I think, is really critical to making the arts accessible
Oh,
and valuable to the entire audience. I think it would be a mistake to look at the arts and wield them only toward a certain demographic or a certain folk. I think art is intrinsic to the human experience, and as a result, every person has a say in the direction it goes. And there are certainly communities that in the past have been very potentially elitist or isolationist. And overwhelmingly those communities don't survive. They tend to fall into obscurity, or they might end up in a book somewhere, but relative to their breathing continued practice, they don't tend to survive. So I think it's not only a good idea and an ethical idea, I think it is inherently essential to the survival of the arts, of any form, of any school of thought, for them to continuously incorporate new people and have that exchange.
so what type of relationship do the artists in Rochester have or connection with New York City, which is still number one in the world for art?
Mm-hmm. I can say on that, relative to Rochester, New York, Rochester's arts community is fairly it's larger than you normally would think it is,
Yeah,
partially via
yeah.
our connections to spaces like Kodak, of course. Like, this is the hometown of American photography. We have a really large art culture here. I have found as well that Rochester's arts community has a back and forth tether with New York City's art scene, partially because
Oh,
you'll find that there are previous generations of New York artists who might end up moving to Rochester. Famously, we formerly had a place called the Hungerford, which was an abandoned factory that had been repurposed to be a studio art space. And that space was often originally housed by a lot of older New York artists who wanted a larger workspace. And really helped build up Rochester's arts community in those decades prior and into what it is today. So I would say there's inherently a back and forth there, just on like geographic location. We're within several hours of each other.
yeah.
Um, and as well, relative to like the modern era of a lot of younger artists, myself included, a lot of us are we are engaging in that back and forth, not really just with New York, but with the larger communities around us. I think it's offered a lot more perspective, I would say, to be next door to quote unquote the art capitals of the world. It really, I think it offers a certain standard that people are more confident understanding. This is what I like. This is the expectation I should hold for myself, and it does. I think it does enhance the Rochester experience.
Yes. So, considering all the cuts that are going on in the Trump administration,
Mm-hmm.
started the arts are either the total refocus with taking all the grants, taking everything DEI out of grants. How do you think that's going to impact the art world in your community?
Yeah, I think the Trump administration's policies in a lot of ways are affecting artists. I had the chance to talk to a an art dealer just the other day, and one thing they brought up that completely went over my head initially was that the tariffs and those initiatives. One of the realities is that
Yeah.
goods becoming more expensive means the raw materials artists use become more expensive. So how does that adjust where buying a high quality canvas is now just factually more expensive because the materials you might get from. I mean, I work with wood panels, for example. A significant portion of America's wood and lumber come from Canada, and because we're now at this weird tariff, this deeply unnecessary tariff, this egotistic experience we're all going through. That does affect those mediums and those resources relative to the discontinuation of fundings toward the arts and even education. I do find that really disheartening. I am hoping for and looking into ways to expand the arts in our community and maintain them, but I don't think it's not surprising, unfortunately. I think conservatism is not very invested in the arts as a tool of expression as much as a
Yeah.
tool of upholding the status quo. Part of my research, part of my master's degree was in propaganda and looking at it historically and observing how it affects communities, marginalized communities, especially African American communities.
Yes.
And one of the realities of the work we do in the work that art plays is that art is a political tool in any way, shape, and form. It is something that helps you relate to the human experience. I can make you, someone who doesn't know me, can see my work and be touched by it. I've
Yeah.
made works, for example, I have a painting of my grandmother's hand from when she passed in 2015.
Hmm.
And I've seen people cry in front of that painting. I've seen people respond to it, come up to me and tell me stories about their own family members, their own histories. There's an ability for the arts to interact with people from different economic backgrounds, from different races, ethnicities, religious experiences, and the idea of inclusion and the idea of being able to communicate with someone who could be radically different from you. That is something that I think conservatism inherently fears. I think the idea of being able to, I think conservatism benefits from the psychological segregation of people. Obviously, at times it benefits from straight up like impractical actually happening segregation. But I think the segregation of people emotionally and intellectually is to the benefit of conservatism, and as a result, there has always been an attack on the arts. There's always been an argument to defund them, to focus more on quote unquote STEM jobs and spaces that do not necessarily encourage the emotional intelligence of people. But I think it's wider than that. I think the current attacks on education, schooling, the Department of Education, a
Yeah,
lot
that's
of that in the
crazy.
broader sense has to do with the idea of muting, I think, the American spirit of people, of how we are. I think we have seen in the last 30 years this radical expansion of art as a tool for people coming together. We brought up the Amy Sherald and Kahide Wiley paintings a moment ago. The way those paintings reach their audience is in a way that is very intentional and speaks to a group of people who have not always been spoken to. I think that is
In the
something
music,
conservatives.
because rappers have basically taken over the music industry globally. I mean, they were ostracized. Time Warner owned the distribution before rappers really started, and they distribute their own records through parties or whatever, made millions. Then they let them come on. Oh, and they have really excelled. So you are right. That's a medium that people were not listening to, but now you got people rapping all around the world. I went to the Middle East, they rap over there. Those kids know rap music better than I do. They
I
do.
mean, the way I think Kendrick said it best, nothing's more influential than rap music, and I think there's a
Exactly.
larger conversation there on like black culture to be said. That I
Yes.
think black
Yeah.
culture is one of the most influential cultural forces in the world. I mean, like you were mentioning,
Always has
you go
been.
across the world, you can look at fashion across the world and see how radically that's been influenced by not only the
Exactly.
wider Pan African experience, but specifically the African American experience.
Yes.
And
All in
I
Asia.
do think, yeah,
They,
and that
yeah.
the ability for that art to reach and to connect people, I think conservatism thrives in isolation. It thrives in the ability for me to not look at you and see the same.
Yes.
So the ability for me and you to me and you, like I think we were talking about Michael Jackson earlier. You have folk who like there was a time in the 90s and 80s where you could speak completely different languages, but you could, the way my older cousins tell me, but we all knew the Thriller album, right? Like, and even though I don't necessarily think every artwork is inherently a deeply political thing, I do think that there's a political endeavor of communication, and who is able to speak to one another and how we speak to each other is intentional, and how we and I think there's a concern to regulate that, because it's not in the interest of, I think, conservative forces to look at me and you and see the same person, to look at me and you and see someone in Palestine and see us and to see the same person, for me and you to look at someone
Sure.
in the Congo and see the same person.
Yes.
It's is in their benefit, I think, to mitigate and remove that to the best of their ability. So it doesn't. I often say sometimes I am disappointed, but I'm rarely surprised with the Trump administration, where obviously they are not interested in the expansion of the arts and the expansion of culture. Conservatism is inherently an ideology that that can only thrive in restriction, which
Yeah.
I find ironic. How much they perseverate on tradition, partially because at the end of the day, the single oldest tradition is change. The only thing that is consistent is the fact that things change and they grow and they become more nuanced. And the
Totally agree.
yeah, the obsession with simplification and I guess, yeah, this obsession with simplification and the removal of nuance, I think it's antithetical to human progress, to be perfectly honest.
I
But
totally
relative to the
agree.
arts, I
Yeah.
think it's counterproductive to what we can be as a people, and I think that's intentional. So it's unfortunate, but I'm hopeful in the long term.
So, with you being a professor and really knowing the Rochester area, do you think galleries and even your university are going to resist these changes that he's trying to implement or work around them? Or what do you see happening? Or is
I
it,
definitely think they're. I think this is a the current movements of the administration has been a rallying cry for a lot of the local spaces. ROCO, the Rochester Contemporary Arts Center, has already had open conversations about these things.
oh,
Relative to
wow.
RIT, that's something that's come up as well. This was also something that happened years prior with the previous Trump administration, where the arts community of Rochester came together and recognized that we do have the privilege of being in New York State, so there are certain protections we have, but not necessarily just coasting on the fact that we're in New York, so we're safe. And understanding that we have a responsibility to not only just maintain the resources we have, but to continue expanding them into spaces that still don't have them, or have them at a minimally in comparison. So I'm part of the reason I am hopeful, as I've mentioned earlier, is because I know I have the privilege of being in an environment of other people who will fight, who have been having this
Oh,
fight
good.
for decades
That's good.
prior, who've gone through other conservative administrations that have these reductive views on arts and education. I recognize it's an uphill battle, but I think it's one we have the strength for.
Yeah, because I'm in Chicago, so I feel that that's why everybody feels they are not listening to anything he says. And the shortage is that he will have fiscally from, the National Endowment of the Arts, which to me has never been funded at the level it should have been funded at. I'm hoping and I'm seeing that other corporations based out of Illinois are stepping up to the plate and not defunding or taking their money away from,
Mm-hmm.
funding the arts, and hopefully that'll be helpful. With that said, um, what do you see yourself doing in the next 3 years to, as an artist, not as a
Mm-hmm.
professor, to help support younger people um, to make sure that their artistic talents are not doused, and show them through your art that this is something we need to really be visible with and continue to do.
I think one of the priorities I have as an artist is to hmm, the best way to explain this. Have you ever, when I was younger, I was really interested in magic tricks, like seeing how someone makes something disappear and reappear. And I think there are two ways you love a magic trick. There's the awe of not knowing how it's done, of seeing, I don't know, the dove fly out of the sleeve, all those kinds of things. And then there's the act of understanding it and understanding the endeavor, like what they're doing, the sleight of hand, the other factors. And I think the second way you love as a result of it is there's the first way, which is being in shock and awe and under like, wow, it blows my mind. And then there is understanding exactly how it works and still feeling awe and understanding that once you remove all of the pretenses from it, that this is still a highly skilled thing that you are passionate about, that you care about. And I think about that a lot in my day-to-day life, the idea of having things that I am both in awe of and then also understanding them and finding a continued and expanding love for that thing in that knowledge. When it comes to the arts, one thing I would like to do, and I do as well, is I aim to I think everyone's really impressed by work. I think you look at great art and you're moved by it, like we've talked about with the portraits. But one thing I want to do for younger artists as well is take a moment to kind of pull that veil back and talk about the actual practice, the material attributes, to encourage a love for that process and the journey of making art. I think that's something that one of the bigger hurdles we have as artists, especially if we're aiming to be professionals, which many young artists I work with are. One of the bigger hurdles people have is that we talk about art culturally sometimes like it's this magic act, like it's, oh man, it's just different, it's inherently different. And there's beauty in that. But getting to a point where we can address that again, there is a practice here, there's a skill, there's something that's happening here that is intentional and focused and honed, and encouraging younger artists to find love in that process, I think is one of the biggest things I hope to do. I hope to give students, and not just students but the younger artists in the next few years, better perspective on what our industry is like, understanding the pros, the cons, and those factors, and cultivating a love for something that is entirely known and entirely understood, to look at the arts world and your own art practice and see and understand it in broad daylight and still find love and magic in that experience, because that's something that I have a very I would argue I have a fairly I find magic in understanding why things go a certain way, understanding the processes, the labor of it. I love looking at my paintings and going, "Wow, this came out really well." But I also find love in that like 50 hours it took me to do that. I find that's something that I that's something I want to encourage in younger artists as well. I don't think this is necessarily a massively prevalent issue, but one of the concerning things I've seen in the past has been that you have people who are very invested in the arts as a idea, as an experience, as a result, and not necessarily as an endeavor. I think art is an endeavor. It's artwork. It's a task you do. It is an endeavor towards something. I like to think it's an endeavor toward truth. But I think that's something I want to encourage and expand in younger artists over the next few years.
So, do you, in your, as respect to you being a professor, do you teach artists about the business side of art?
I talk with my experience being in my late 20s now. I'm actively in the industry. I'm in these meetings in these different spaces. One thing I will do often is talk to artists about like if I have my students come in, I'll say, "Hey, this week I worked with a gallery to show some work. I'm going to do a brief lecture on what that experience was like, the pros, the cons, or I'll talk to them about, hey, here's a bad experience I had maybe 2 years ago, and here are the red flags that I could have noticed earlier but didn't necessarily know. So to hopefully help you with that." One thing I do for fun with my students is if you're an artist on Instagram, you get scammers and things like that. I will often like humor those conversations and drag them on just long enough to have a threaded conversation, just so I can take screenshots of it, put it on the TV in the classroom, and walk my students through step by step. Hey, here's what a bad what a scammer looks like, or here's what a commission that isn't a scam but would be bad looks like, versus here's a commission that is pretty good versus here's a great commission. Here's what that like the language of it, how serious they are, what like the expectations they have of you and what expectations you should have of them. I find my active daily experiences of being in the arts world as a professional is something that when I'm working with younger artists, especially with students, that business element of it, making sure that you know how to market yourself, that you know what are really good resources and which ones you have for free, what things you pay for, what is worth paying for, and things that are investments in yourself. That's something I do during when my students are working. There'll often be a session of the class where there's really nothing to directly teach at that moment because the students just have to spend 20 minutes or 30 minutes doing a thing, and I have to see how they have to go through the process. And during that time, I usually fit in a brief segment about, hey, here's a scammer who tried to reach out to me. This is a common scam. Here's how you know that scam happened so you don't get scammed. I've had students in the past who via people reaching out for alleged commissions ended up getting in horrible situations because they
Oh,
had their accounts compromised or their banking information stolen, stuff like that. So I'm really motivated to keep a pulse on those things for the well-being, especially for younger artists. It's very easy when you're new at something to have a bad experience and be pushed away from it. And I think there's the responsibility other elders have had toward me and the responsibility I hold myself is to help protect younger artists that are on their own early. And I say this, I'm 28, but people who are younger than me is a better way to word that. And
or less
all,
experience.
yeah, less experience is even a better way to word that. People who are at earlier points in their careers than I am, and using what I know for their benefit.
So, do you think, or do you teach artists there are other ways to become successful besides just having a gallery represent you?
Oh, absolutely. One thing I talk about with my students as well, I actually just had a very long conversation with a student who was interested in the idea of potentially showing at like conventions and like showing art in those spaces. As well, I have artists students, for example, who are interested in working through Etsy's and other resources like that, or going to like Renaissance fairs and things, and finding ways to find what you want to make, what market exists there, how to find that market and go from there. I will be clear, I do think I have many peers who are more qualified than I am to talk about those things in greater detail, but in my active experience on the weekly basis, I have enough of that experience to talk about it and be honest as well. Part of it as well is being honest about, like I've mentioned before, moments where I've had bad commissions or people have reached out and they said, hey, I'd love to do this or that, and it sounds great, but the moment you introduce paperwork, then suddenly they get a bit,
Yeah,
uh, yeah,
yes,
having those
which
moments
is
where like,
crazy.
yeah, like, oh yeah, we're totally down for this, but oh, what do you mean you're like, I have to sign this legally binding document, like stuff like part of I think the responsibility of teaching is to be as transparent as reasonable in those situations where you talk about obviously the things that go well because you want to encourage a successful path, but you also have a responsibility, I believe, to talk about the moments where things got a bit unfortunate. I told
Yes,
students about stories where I've had artwork destroyed because a curator was not as careful with them as they could have been, and those stories are hard for me because it was a tragedy for me, but I recognize that in me telling that story, I'm preparing a student to know what to expect and what to avoid. In the same way, I've had mentors tell me stories about work that they've had that's been damaged or stolen or other things like that. Um, Part
the
of our field,
gallery's not insured. A lot of
yeah, our gallery's insured. Is that gallery reputable?
yeah,
Are they overcharging you?
yeah,
And yeah, I think part of, again, this idea of developing a love for something and cultivating a community is to address that, what in any garden you build, sooner or later there might be a thorn. In any environment you build, there might be a crack in the ground. You have a responsibility to acknowledge those things for the betterment of the total community. Yeah, speaking to Rochester, I can't speak to Chicago specifically,
yeah,
but what I find is one of the things that is more organic is that, like you mentioned, you created a space for people to come in their own ways, and those are people around you, other artists you know. Often, every generation of any institution or organization, or I'm not right wording this correctly, any generation of any field, more often than not, will make their own spaces in some capacity. And what ends up happening is that there's often going to be a certain amount of overlap, and hopefully there's a strong tether between them. But it's not uncommon to see younger artists want to organize and aggregate with themselves and different eras
Yeah.
or different types of artists. One thing that's important, though, relative to museums and larger spaces, is to continually make the endeavor of expanding. And that's not something that's always going to be achievable in a year. You might not see the fruits of that within 2 years. But for example, we have larger institutions in Rochester that make an intentional effort to show local artists, to have arts organizations, to create events and things that are for, hey, if you're under 25 and under, this show is for
Yeah.
you, things like
Okay, this
that.
is helping.
And
Yeah.
as well saying, hey, this is an event where, again, some museums are, I can't speak to the rationale behind it. What I can tell is what I've seen. You have some museums that are prioritizing the global day-to-day scale, and as a result, they're not necessarily involved with who's down the street from them. And I think there's validity to that, but I also find that relative to, I think, how do I put this? There are some spaces that are the institute of insert city here, but very rarely are they the institute of that city,
Yeah.
where you have where in theory that institution could exist anywhere and it wouldn't be radically
Yes.
different from its day to
Yeah.
day. And I think that's a more complicated conversation. I think if you play a role in if you are the Rochester School of Art or the whatever school of this, if you in owning that you are in that area, I think I personally believe you have an accountability to that space, and
I
especially if there are disproportionate
yeah.
accesses there, especially relative to lower income, relative to potential racial barriers that may have existed. I find as well in my experience with museums that these are older institutions. Some of these institutions are hundreds of years old, depending
That's
on which
how it
one you're
is with the
asking.
museum.
And the reality is the
Yeah.
systems that are in place, I don't often, what I find is that there are sometimes barriers that prevent certain people from being in those spaces, but I don't find that they're often being intentionally held up. It's kind of like if you're walking in a neighborhood, you might see 1,000 fences and you don't care because they don't get in the way of you on the sidewalk. You don't notice a fence or a wall or a barrier until it affects you personally.
Yeah.
More often than not, very rarely do people have the purview to look around and say, is that fence number 5? Is that fence a problem? I think when you look at academic spaces, especially museums, the people who are in those positions of power more often than not are people who've always had access or had relatively easy access to those spaces. So their ability to walk down the sidewalk with no impediment, without being impeded,
Hmm.
is more consistent. So I think it's really a matter of blind spots. I think more often than not, there are underserved communities that are not in those conversations to vocalize that, hey, fence number 4 gets in the way, because and the people who are used to never having to deal with fences 1 through 5 they don't have any witness of it. And that's why I think a lot of academic spaces and museum spaces have a responsibility to have these open meetings, because open meetings, open community engagement, partially because it might just be a day where everyone gets to come in and like really associate with the space, which is always in itself, that always pays for itself in the long run, I believe. But in these meetings, I've seen moments where people say, hey, have you considered this? And I've seen like the light switch go off in someone's head. We're like, oh my God, I didn't even consider that. And part of that comes into, I think there's a necessity for training people to understand other perspectives, to step outside of themselves, to recognize the pros and cons of their position in life, their privileges they may have, and the ways that they might not be initially aware of disadvantages of other groups of people, especially in the arts. One thing about the arts that people don't always talk about is that doing arts at a professional level can be relatively expensive. So what ends up happening for a lot of artists, especially younger artists who might show a ton of potential, they are not always able to necessarily afford the higher quality materials that people would
Yeah.
expect in professional
And even have a
spaces.
studio space.
Yeah, even have a studio space. Oh my
Yeah.
God. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was just looking at just studio spaces. My students were asking me about this, so I was looking into it further. Depending on the cities you live in, just getting a studio space that's has,
It's
let's just talk about bare
expensive.
minimums. You want outlets, you want solid floors, you want windows,
Exactly.
you want
Exactly.
air. Spaces like that just to work in. I mean, you're basically buying a second apartment, and
Exactly. Yeah.
apartment costs are exceptionally expensive
Yeah.
for a hole in the wall, especially if you're talking about places like New York or the larger cities. I've talked to artists
Same in
in my
Chicago.
yeah, I've talked to artists in Miami and in LA, and in those experiences, they've brought up the same where if there's kind of you talked about this idea of younger artists and older artists. I think one of the problems we have is that you'll have artists who are in their 40s and up. You'll have artists who are in their like 25 and under. There isn't a large I feel like we struggle with that middle population of people like 25 to 35, like a 25 to 40 range, partially because so many people in that age range are often at different points financially in their lives, where they have different certain like there's in a family you have the kids, you have the parents, you have the grandkids, you have the grandparents, you might have the great grandparents. There is a direct path of A to B to C and so on. But I think in the arts communities often there are gaps, generational gaps, especially depending on the neighborhood itself, the community, and who is available, and that makes it harder for people to bridge certain things. It's hard to I don't know.
And I
It's hard to appreciate like it's hard to appreciate jazz if you don't necessarily have someone in the middle who showed you disco.
and thank you so much because you helped so much. You're very knowledgeable. You ought to
Thank
think
you.
about writing a book and maybe lecturing outside of Rochester because I
Hopefully in the future, yeah.
yeah, because I talk to a lot of people and for your age you're quite knowledgeable and you come
Thank
across
you.
well. I think you have a lot that you could share. So please don't just stay in Rochester. Get out of your circle eventually and let people hear what you have to say. You have a lot to say.
Thank you. And if I want to credit anyone for it, a lot of the people around me, my mentors and family figures, have been teachers, community elders, and mentors in some capacity. A lot of my desire to communicate and have these kinds of conversations comes from that background. So again, I coming back to it all, I think it's really a matter of community. And I would say, relative to my Rochester experience, I've been fortunate to have an exceptional community around me, both as an artist, as an educator, and as a person overall. So yeah, I agree. It's essential work, and I hope to expand it.
Do you have a YouTube channel?
I have a YouTube channel that is honestly I haven't uploaded a while there for different paintings. I'm looking into reviving it in the near future,
You
but
need
I do have Instagrams and other social medias that I post content on,
yeah, that
educational content and painting.
yeah, you need to do an educational YouTube channel as a lecturer, as a professor, and talk about the different subjects you can talk about because it would be really knowledgeable for a lot of people. Because I do know several of the mentors that I have, the younger artists talk about, they want to know about career choices, they want to know about different things, and you'd be the type of person they would listen to.
If you
You,
have any recommendations or people I could potentially connect to, I'm entirely open to that as well. Yeah, let me. Yeah, I'll
but
continue doing thing. I'll continue it on my end as well, though.
yeah,
Yes.
you should. I mean, I think it would be very potentially good for you for your future and even think about writing some books because nowadays you can self-publish. But I think doing a blog where you're talking, I think that would be good for your career. I really.
Hmm.
Well, Unique, thank you so very much for allowing me to feature you and for you to talk to me that are younger. Alan Singer was the person that I don't know if you know Alan.
Oh
Maybe
yeah, Alan was one of my teachers
yeah,
in
he's my
college.
buddy. He is
Yeah,
like
he's such a great guy.
isn't he? Isn't he?
Yeah.
Oh, he's just so awesome.
And
So,
he's just really refreshing as well. I
isn't
remember as
he?
a student, there would be moments where, like, I'd do a project, and he'd obviously have very, like, apt and really solid critique, and he'd always say it in a really fun way. I had a painting project I was doing where I was using a technique, this really old technique to do it. And he's like, "Yeah, Unique, it came together, but this technique's like 200 years old. There's newer stuff, And I was like, "Oh wow, all right, cool." But that was also like in his brevity, there's a way of communicating there that I think is really important. I feel people look at academic spaces and they expect everyone to, be super serious all the time and
Yes,
like, and
he's a
yes
great
and no
guy.
and yeah, like very uptight. And I feel like Alan Singer is a very he's profoundly knowledgeable, but
Yes.
he's also accessible. And I feel for a lot of people, especially relative if you're new to academic spaces, that can be very intimidating to
Yeah.
walk up to someone. Like, it is very hard to walk up not even knowing what you do not know to someone who knows what you want to know and knows how you need to hear it. Like, it's like walking up to the crystal ball. Like, you don't know. Like, and I think Alan Singer does a terrific job of being accessible and caring about his students.
Yeah, he's so
I've
nice.
directly benefited from him, from that.
He would be a great person for you to talk about started lecturing and starting a podcast to give you some ideas.
Yeah,
You never know.
I'll take a note of that.
Yeah, or either just start to look out there on YouTube and see what people have got going on. You're a young brother that's got a voice, and I would like to see you out there. I mean, I think it would work for you. I'm gonna
I'm just
let
taking notes right now of potential people. Yeah, so I'm very serious about that. I will I'll have a list to you in the near future.
Yeah, just take your time. Because I usually produce my magazines whenever I finish an issue, and sometimes I do four in a month, sometimes I do five, sometimes I don't. But it gives me the latitude to add people, when I get them when they are referred to me.
Mhm.
Okay, so you have a nice day.
Likewise, have a good day.
Yes. And I look forward to working on your magazine. Take
Yeah,
care.
thank you, and thank you again for the opportunity. I hope you have a great day and great weekend as well.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.